My mother-in-law sold my grandmother's vintage wedding dress on eBay for $1,500. She didn't ask. She didn't hesitate. She didn't blink. She said it like she was commenting on the weather, like it was something irrelevant, like memory had no market value. She used the money to buy her daughter a designer handbag, a limited edition piece Sarah will post on Instagram with a caption about self-love, a bag she will pretend she worked for, a bag she will forget about in 6 months when the trend changes. When I found out, I didn't hear her words first. I saw the empty garment bag. It was still hanging in the attic, zipped open, vacant, like something had been surgically removed from time. The wooden hanger was still inside, slightly tilted, as if it remembered the weight of the dress. That dress wasn't just fabric. It was my grandmother's last real possession. The only thing she kept from a life that started before credit cards and ended before anyone learned how to say self-expression out loud. I stood there longer than I should have. Not crying, not reacting, just calculating. Not numbers yet, not money, patterns. Because people like Beatrice don't think in symbols. They think in utility. Everything is usable. Everything is exchangeable. Everything is replaceable. Except they never understand what they break when they convert memory into currency. I walked downstairs, slowly. No urgency, no confrontation. Because confrontation is emotional language. And I had already stopped speaking that language a long time ago. I went into my office. The room is intentionally neutral. White walls, clean desk. No family photos, only systems. I opened my laptop and logged into Serenity Springs financial portal, a name that sounds like peace, but functions like dependency. For 3 years, I had been paying $10,000 a month, quietly, consistently, without discussion, without recognition. My mother-in-law lives there like royalty. Private suite, chef on demand, spa services, medical supervision. She calls it her deserved comfort. I call it an error that never corrected itself. My cursor hovered over the payment system. Auto renewal, active. Account holder, Claire. Beneficiary, Beatrice Harlan. I stared at it for a few seconds. Not emotional, just precise. Then I clicked delete scheduled payments. The system paused. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just a loading circle. Like even machines hesitate before consequences. Then, confirmed. And suddenly, the silence wasn't emotional. It was structural. Something had changed in the architecture of her life. She just didn't know it yet.
My name is Claire. I'm 38. I manage estate structures and private asset portfolios for high net worth families who prefer invisibility over attention. People think my job is money. It's not. My job is control over what money touches, which means I understand something most people don't. Money doesn't create power. It reveals who already has it, and who is just borrowing it temporarily. Mark, my husband, is a good man. That's the simplest way to describe him. But good is not the same as strong. He was raised by Beatrice, and Beatrice doesn't raise children. She calibrates them. She adjusts guilt levels. She adjusts obligation thresholds. She adjusts emotional compliance until it becomes personality. Mark learned early that peace in his house was conditional, and conditions always came from her. Not him. Not us. Her. She is 70 years old now, but she behaves like authority is still negotiable. She doesn't ask for things. She declares them. And people around her learned to respond instead of question. That's how she survived. That's how she controlled everything, without ever calling it control.
Sarah, my sister-in-law, is the opposite problem. If Beatrice is control disguised as tradition, Sarah is entitlement disguised as freedom. She doesn't work, she doesn't build, she doesn't maintain. She just consumes narratives about herself. She believes she is lucky, not because she earned anything, but because she never had to see the system that feeds her. She thinks the money comes from a trust. That word is important, trust, because that's what they built their entire reality on. A belief that resources are inherited, not managed, and that someone else will always handle consequences. They never asked me what I do. Not really. To them, I am stable, which is another way of saying invisible. I pay bills, I solve problems, I fix gaps they don't see. And I don't interrupt their stories about how things work. Because people don't like discovering that their comfort is maintained by someone they underestimate. The first fracture wasn't the dress. The first fracture happened months earlier, when Beatrice started calling Serenity Springs her home. Not her residence, not her facility, her home. As if ownership was emotional, not contractual. She started redecorating mentally, talking about her staff, her routine, her rights. She forgot she was a guest in a system I built. And systems are dangerous when they are forgotten. Because forgotten systems stop being passive. They become conditional. That morning, after I deleted the payments, I didn't tell anyone. Not Mark, not Sarah, not Beatrice. There is a difference between secrecy and timing. Secrecy hides. Timing waits. And I was waiting. Because Beatrice had already done something irreversible. She just hadn't felt the consequences yet.
The attic is where things go to die quietly. Not physically, socially. It's where families store versions of themselves they don't want to look at anymore. Old clothes, old furniture, old identities that no longer fit the narrative downstairs. That's where I found it. Or rather, that's where I found what was left of it. The garment bag, empty. Not hidden, not disguised. Just abandoned. Like it had stopped mattering halfway through being discarded. The zipper was still slightly open, as if whoever did it wasn't trying to erase it properly. Just reduce it. Reduce meaning to inconvenience. I remember touching the fabric inside. Nothing. No weight, no texture. Just absence pretending to be storage. That was the first real emotional hit. Not anger. Disorientation. Because the brain doesn't process symbolic theft immediately. It tries to find a practical explanation first. Maybe it was moved. Maybe it was cleaned. Maybe it was stored elsewhere. Then I saw the hanger. Still inside. Wrapped in dust. That was when I understood. This wasn't relocation. This was conversion. Downstairs, life was normal. That's the part that always feels the most surreal in moments like this. The world refuses to pause for your internal rupture. Beatrice was in the kitchen. Tea kettle clicking. Ceramic spoon tapping the cup. Routine sounds pretending nothing has changed. Sarah was on her phone, laughing at something invisible to everyone else. Mark was reading emails, avoiding eye contact with the atmosphere. And then there was me, standing in the doorway, still holding the empty garment bag. Not moving, not speaking, just present in a way that didn't belong to the room anymore. Beatrice looked up first, not surprised, not curious, just mildly annoyed that I was interrupting her silence. "Oh," she said, "you found it." No explanation, no pause, no emotional weight, just confirmation, like we were discussing an item from inventory. I remember asking, "Where is it?" She didn't even look up from her cup. I sold it. 3 words, no hesitation, no emotional bridging, just transaction language applied to memory. Then she added, "Sarah needed something nice for Vegas." That was it. That was the justification architecture. One person loses memory, another gains status. Balance restored in her mind. I looked at her for a few seconds, not reacting yet, because reaction gives people permission to continue. She finally looked at me and smiled, not apologetic, not uncertain, confident. The kind of smile people wear when they assume authority will protect them from consequences. It was just fabric, Claire. That sentence matters, because it wasn't ignorance, it was classification. She had downgraded meaning into material. And once something is classified as just, it becomes permanently disposable in that person's mind. Just fabric, just money, just space, just help, just you. Sarah didn't even look up. She said, "I mean, you don't even wear it." As if usage determines ownership of memory. As if emotional value requires active rotation. Mark stayed silent. That silence was familiar. It's the kind of silence that is not neutral. It is permission disguised as discomfort. He wasn't agreeing, but he wasn't stopping it either. And in systems like this, absence of resistance becomes alignment. I set the empty bag on the counter. Slowly. Deliberately. Not dramatic. controlled. Then I said something I didn't expect to come out of me so calmly. That dress belonged to my grandmother. Beatrice finally looked directly at me. A small pause. Then, "Oh, please, don't make everything sentimental." That's when the emotional temperature shifted. Not upward, downward. Because dismissing memory is not aggression. It's erasure. And erasure is final. The kitchen light felt different after that moment. Not brighter or darker, just more clinical. Like the room stopped being domestic and became observational. I remember hearing the kettle stop. Click. Silence filled the space behind it. And in that silence, something inside me reorganized. Not anger, not sadness. Structure. A mental reclassification of everyone in the room. Beatrice stood up, walked past me, took her cup, and said, almost casually, "I don't know why you're so emotional lately." That sentence is important too, because it reframes reaction as instability, not response, but defect. She walked out of the kitchen like the conversation had already ended, like there was nothing unresolved, like nothing had shifted. But something had, because in my mind, I stopped seeing her as a person I needed to convince, and started seeing her as a system that had exceeded its terms. That evening, Mark tried to smooth it over. He always does. He has a particular rhythm for it. Soft voice, careful language, avoiding sharp edges. Maybe she didn't realize how important it was to you. That's what he said. Not defending her, but minimizing the fracture. I looked at him, and I asked, if I stopped paying for everything tomorrow, would she still live there? He didn't answer immediately. That pause told me everything, because he already knew the answer. He just didn't want to articulate it. That night, I opened my laptop again. Not to act, just to confirm. Serenity Springs portal. Account status, active. Payment history, continuous. Next billing cycle, pending. Everything's still running on invisible momentum. Except now, I was aware of it. And awareness changes systems more than action does. Because once you see the structure, you can no longer unsee the dependency. I didn't delete anything that night. Not yet. Because revenge is emotional acceleration. And I wasn't accelerating. I was mapping. And Beatrice? She was sleeping peacefully, in a structure she believed belonged to her, not knowing the foundation had just been marked for removal. The first sign that something had changed wasn't dramatic. It never is. Systems don't announce collapse. They adjust pressure, quietly, subtly, like a room slowly losing oxygen without anyone noticing immediately. It started with a phone call, not to me, to Beatrice, at 9:14 a.m. I was already at the hospital when Mark texted me. Mom says the retirement home called her twice, something about billing. I didn't respond immediately, because I already knew. Serenity Springs doesn't call unless something structural has shifted. They send reminders first, then notices, then silence, then action. So 2 calls meant one thing. The system had already moved past courtesy. Beatrice called me at 9:27. I didn't pick up. She called again, then a voicemail. Her voice wasn't angry. It was confused. That's always the first stage of collapse for people who believe stability is permanent. Not fear, confusion. Claire, there seems to be an issue with the account. They were saying something about payment interruption. Call me back immediately. No mention of gratitude. No mention of context. Just expectation of correction. Like I was still part of her internal infrastructure. At 10:03, Mark called. I answered. He didn't say hello. Just, did you do something? That question is important, because it wasn't accusation yet. It was recognition trying to become understanding. I said, yes. Silence. Then, why? And I answered honestly, because the system is no longer aligned with usage. He didn't respond for a long time. Then, you stopped the payments? Yes. Another silence. Longer this time. Then he said something I didn't expect. She's freaking out. Not anger, not judgment, just observation, like reporting a weather condition. Meanwhile, Beatrice had already shifted behavior. I could reconstruct it without being there. That's the
the thing about predictable personalities. They follow sequence. First, denial. Then, external blame. Then, authority escalation. At 11:12, she called Serenity Springs directly, demanding to speak to the manager. At 11:18, she was transferred. At 11:21, she was told the account was inactive due to non-payment. At 11:22, she said, "That is impossible. My daughter-in-law handles everything." At 11:23, the representative replied, "We have no active payment authorization on file." That sentence, that moment, that is where reality stops being negotiable.
By 12 o'clock, she stopped calling the facility and started calling family. Sarah first, then Mark again, then my office line, then my personal number again, and again, and again. Each attempt less composed than the previous, because she was trying to locate the missing piece of her system. Me. Not as a person, as function. At 12:47, Sarah sent a message to Mark. "Is Claire doing this as a joke? Mom is saying she got kicked out of the system." That wording matters. Got kicked out. As if housing is digital banishment. As if consequences are glitches. At 13:30, Mark came home early. I knew because he didn't text. He just arrived. That's how you know someone has crossed from confusion into confrontation. They stop communicating. They start appearing. He stood in the kitchen for a moment. Didn't sit. Didn't speak. Then, "She's saying she's being evicted from her care facility." I nodded. "Correct." He exhaled slowly. Then, "Claire, this is gonna get ugly." That was the first emotionally honest thing he said all day. Not moral judgment, not defense, just forecast. I looked at him and said, "It was already ugly. You just weren't watching the system from my side." He didn't respond, because he understood that sentence more than he wanted to admit. Triss reached the second stage. She stopped calling service providers and started rewriting the narrative. That's what people do when control collapses. They convert consequence into conspiracy. She told Sarah, "Claire has been planning this for months." She told Mark, "She's trying to take the house." She told anyone who would listen, "This is financial abuse." The irony is always the same. When systems they benefited from become visible, they rename accountability as aggression. But the truth was simpler. There was no hidden plan, no revenge architecture, no emotional escalation, just removal of support. That's all. And when you remove invisible support from someone who depends on it, they don't fall immediately. They float for a while. Then they realize there was nothing underneath. At 17:42, Serenity Springs issued a formal notice. 30-day transition requirement. No extension, no reinstatement. Standard protocol for account termination. It was polite, clinical, indifferent. The way systems always are when they stop recognizing a user as necessary. At 18:10, Beatrice called Mark again, this time crying. Not strategic crying, not manipulative crying. Confusion crying. The kind that happens when someone realizes their narrative has stopped matching external reality. "Mark, I don't understand. This doesn't make sense. She can't just do this." And Mark said something that I think surprised even him. "She can." Silence. Then she said, "Why would she do this to me?" And he didn't answer, because the honest answer wasn't emotional. It was structural. By evening, the household dynamic had shifted completely. Not exploded, shifted, like tectonic plates adjusting without earthquake. Sarah was silent. Mark was withdrawn. Beatrice was oscillating between anger and disbelief. And I was still at work, still operating normally, because nothing in my external life had changed. Only theirs had. That's the difference between being inside a system and owning its switches. At 2200, I received one final message from Beatrice that day. Short, uncharacteristically simple. "Call me, please." No capital letters, no authority, just request. That's how you know hierarchy has started to collapse. Language softens. I didn't reply, not out of cruelty, but because engagement would have implied shared reality, and we were no longer in the same system. That night, Mark sat on the edge of the bed for a long time. Then he said quietly, "I didn't think she depended on you this much." And I answered, "She didn't. She depended on not knowing she did." Outside, nothing looked different. Same house, same streets, same city noise. But somewhere between those hours, a financial structure that had held a family identity together for years had stopped functioning. And nobody knew yet whether it would be replaced or collapse completely. By the third day, Beatrice stopped pretending this was a misunderstanding. That's usually how it shifts. First confusion, then denial, then narrative construction. Then, finally, the moment reality becomes too consistent to reinterpret. And she crossed that line at 8:06 a.m. I got the first email from Serenity Springs that morning. Subject line, resident account status update. Urgent review required. Not sent to me directly. Copied. Because by then, my role had already changed in their system. From payer to former payer. That single distinction changes tone instantly. At 8:19 a.m., Beatrice arrived at the facility reception. I wasn't there, but I later reconstructed it from the staff report Mark forwarded me. She didn't walk in like someone who had lost access. She walked in like someone correcting an administrative error. That's important. People like her don't immediately experience loss as loss. They experience it as malfunction. She told the receptionist, "There has been a mistake with my account. My daughter-in-law handles everything. Fix it immediately." No pleas, no uncertainty. Just command language applied to systems that no longer recognize authority. At 8:24 a.m., she was asked to wait. At 8:26 a.m., she was told the account had been permanently closed due to non-payment. At 8:27 a.m., she said, "That's impossible. She would never do that." That sentence, not "she did this," but "she would never." That's the psychological fracture point, when belief becomes stronger than evidence. At 9:03 a.m., she called Mark. This time her voice wasn't confused anymore. It had stabilized into anger, because anger is easier to hold than uncertainty. "Your wife is trying to punish me." Mark didn't answer immediately. Then he said, "No, she stopped paying." That distinction mattered, but she refused it, because accepting it would require rewriting her entire internal hierarchy. At 10:41 a.m., Sarah entered the conversation fully, and she did what people like her always do in destabilization events. She externalized the threat. "This is emotional abuse. She's financially controlling you guys." The irony was almost procedural at this point. Control being accused of control removal. At 11:15 a.m., Beatrice tried a new angle. She called me. I answered. Not because I intended to engage, but because I needed confirmation of tone shift. Her voice was different. Less command, more compression. Like she was holding herself together using language alone. "Claire, we need to talk about what you're doing." Not asking, still framing herself as central. I said nothing, let her continue. Then came the pivot, the manipulation phase. She said, "I trusted you. I treated you like my own daughter." That sentence is always interesting, because it reframes transaction as relationship. But I didn't respond, so she escalated. "Mark will never forgive you for this." Still no response from me. Then silence, longer than expected. Then, "You're destroying this family." And that's when I finally answered. Calmly. No, I removed myself from sustaining it. That was the first time she paused mid-conversation. Not because she agreed, but because she lost conversational leverage. At 12:30 p.m., Mark came to my office. He didn't sit. He didn't speak immediately. Just stood there. That posture matters. It means internal conflict has reached physical expression. Finally, he said, "She says she might have to move out." I nodded. Yes. He looked at me longer than usual. Then, "You didn't even warn her." And I answered, "I wasn't required to maintain her expectations." Silence. Then he said something quieter. "I didn't realize how dependent everything was on you." I replied, "It wasn't dependent on me. It was dependent on continuity." That distinction landed differently, because dependency implies choice, continuity implies structure. At 2:05 p.m., Beatrice attempted escalation number 3. She went to the property level. She told staff, "This house is part of my family estate." It is not, and she knows it. But people in collapse often try ownership memory as last defense. When systems fail, they rewrite history. At 3:22 p.m., Serenity Springs issued final notice again, this time with relocation options. Standard assisted housing. Not luxury. Not private. Not curated. Just functional. The downgrade wasn't punishment. It was classification correction. At 4:40 p.m., Beatrice called Shara. This time crying again. But different. Not confusion. Not anger. Something closer to humiliation. I don't understand what she's trying to prove. And Sarah said the most revealing thing of all. Maybe she's not trying to prove anything. Maybe she just stopped covering for you. That line shifted something. Because for the first time, the narrative cracked internally between them. At 6 p.m., Mark finally asked me the question he had been avoiding.
Is there any way to reverse this? I looked at him and said, yes, but only if I restart the system I deliberately shut down. He understood immediately and didn't ask again. That night, Beatrice stopped calling. Not because resolution happened, but because exhaustion replaced strategy. That's another stage people miss. After anger fails, after manipulation fails, after authority fails, there was only depletion. At 10:11 p.m., I received a final voicemail. No introduction, no framing, just voice. Tired, smaller than before. Claire, I don't know what I did wrong. That was the first time she didn't accuse. She just questioned reality itself. And I didn't reply. Because by then, the system had already moved past interpersonal logic. It was no longer about right or wrong. It was about dependency visibility. And once dependency is visible, it cannot be unseen again.
There is a moment in every system collapse where nothing new happens anymore. No escalation, no negotiation, no emotional volatility. Just outcomes arriving late to decisions already made. That moment arrived on a Tuesday morning at 7:58 a.m. The final notice from Serenity Springs was not dramatic. It never is. Just structured language, clean formatting, no emotional residue. Resident relocation scheduled within 30 days. No reinstatement of previous financial terms possible. That sentence is where narrative ends and logistics begin. Beatrice read it 3 times, not because it was unclear, but because repetition is what the brain does when reality refuses to bend. First reading, denial. Second reading, interpretation. Third reading, acceptance beginning without permission. She called Mark immediately. Not me. That was intentional. Because when authority collapses, people default to the nearest emotional anchor, even if that anchor is unstable. I was not present for the call, but Mark told me later. Her voice had changed again. Not anger, not confusion, not manipulation. Something closer to disassembly. Mark, I think Claire made a mistake. Mark didn't answer quickly. Then, no, Mark, she didn't. At 9:12 a.m., Sarah attempted one final reframing. She posted a message online, something about family betrayal and unexpected cruelty. But no one engaged, because narratives without structural support collapse faster than systems. At 10:44 a.m., Beatrice attempted to enter Serenity Springs again. Reception denied access to administrative requests. She was allowed in only as a transitioning resident, not an authority, not an owner, not a decision maker, just a scheduled departure. And that was the moment she finally understood something fundamental. She had never been in control of the system. She had only been inside it. At 12 p.m., I reviewed the final financial summary. Not as punishment, not as revenge, just closure. 3 years of structured payments, $10,000 per month, plus maintenance adjustments, plus property tax stabilization, plus emergency interventions. Total system support, continuous, invisible, assumed. And then I saw the final line I had added when I closed the accounts. Operational dependency removed. That was all it said. No emotion, no justification, no narrative. Just classification. At 1:30 p.m., Mark asked me something different this time. Not about reversal, not about consequences, about meaning. Did you feel better after doing it? I paused before answering, because the honest answer wasn't simple. Then I said, no, I felt accurate. He nodded slowly. That was enough for him. At 3 p.m., Beatrice began packing. Not because she accepted, but because she had been scheduled to. That difference matters. Acceptance is emotional. Scheduling is structural. And structures always win in the end. Sarah helped. Not willingly, but practically. Because collapse redistributes labor quickly, and sentiment becomes secondary to logistics. At 4:45 p.m., Beatrice stood in the hallway of what she still called home, for the last time. She looked around like she expected something to interrupt the process, like systems usually do when people believe loudly enough. But nothing interrupted it, because systems don't respond to belief, only configuration. She looked at me once before leaving, longer than before, but still not understanding.
Then she said, "I raised Mark." I replied, "No, you influenced him." That distinction landed quietly, and for the first time, she didn't respond.
At 6:10 p.m., the property was cleared. At 6:11 p.m., the account was fully closed. At 6:12 p.m., Serenity Springs confirmed final transition completion. No remaining obligations, no pending balances, no residual authority. That evening, Mark and I sat in the new apartment. Minimal furniture, neutral lighting, no inherited space, only chosen space. He said, "It feels quieter." And I said, "It is. The system isn't running in the background anymore." Sarah moved out of narrative relevance within weeks, not because she disappeared, but because entitlement without structure doesn't sustain attention. Beatrice was relocated to standard assisted housing. Functional, clean, unremarkable. No longer curated, just maintained. She called once, 2 months later. Not angry, not emotional, just smaller. "Claire, I didn't think it would end like this." I didn't respond for a moment. Then I said, "It didn't end. It corrected." And that was the last conversation. The empty garment bag still exists somewhere in storage. Not as memory, not as symbol anymore. Just object, removed from narrative weight. Because that's the final truth of all ledgers. They don't punish, they balance. And balance doesn't require permission, only timing. Some people think power is loud, but real power is when nothing needs to be said anymore, because the system already responded for you.